My name is Elena Whitmore. I'm 35 years old, and at exactly 6:18 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, while reviewing financial compliance reports for a hospital foundation, my phone vibrated with a message from my mother. 3 lines, nothing more. "You're no longer part of this family. Don't contact us again. We're moving forward without you." She didn't call. She didn't explain. She simply erased me. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then typed one word back. Understood. I was about to close my laptop when something unusual caught my attention in the financial verification system connected to a luxury assisted living facility where my parents were arranging to move my grandmother. A new set of documents had just been submitted, and they were signed electronically with my name, which meant my mother had just told me to disappear from the family, while still using my credentials to keep their entire financial plan standing. 3 days later, my phone showed 64 missed calls from the same people who told me never to contact them again. I grew up in the Whitmore family in Greenwich, Connecticut, a place where reputation mattered almost as much as money. In our part of town, people measured success by the guest lists at charity galas, the size of their homes, and how often their names appeared in the programs of local fundraising events. My mother, Vivian Whitmore, thrived in that world. If you searched her name online, you would find photographs of elegant dinners, speeches about community care, and smiling donors standing beside oversized checks. She served on several charity boards and was especially well known for supporting organizations connected to elder care. To most people in Greenwich, my mother was the perfect example of civic generosity, a graceful woman dedicated to helping others. But the version of our family that existed behind the doors of the Whitmore house worked very differently. Over the years, our household had developed its own quiet crisis management system, and that system was me. I work as a financial compliance investigator. My job is not glamorous, but it requires a particular kind of attention that most people don't enjoy. I read contracts line by line, verify the origin of financial transfers, track inconsistencies between reports, and investigate situations where money might not be moving as transparently as it should. In simple terms, I look for problems before those problems become scandals. My family never seemed particularly impressed by that work, but they relied on it constantly. For years, I was the person they called whenever something complicated appeared in their lives. If my father signed a real estate agreement that suddenly became confusing, I was the one who reviewed the contract. If tax paperwork looked wrong or bank records didn't match, I was the one who stayed up late correcting the issue. Whenever something financial became messy, someone would eventually say the same sentence: "Elena will take a look." And I always did. Not because anyone paid me for it, not because I enjoyed spending my evenings fixing paperwork for people who rarely thanked me. I did it because I believed that helping family was simply part of being family. Every time I solved one of those problems, the response was always identical. "You're just helping the family." Those words were meant to sound affectionate, but over time they began to feel more like an expectation than appreciation. Recently, my mother had been talking excitedly about what she called a new chapter for the Whitmore family. The plan, as she described it to friends at several fundraising events, sounded impressive. First, my parents would sell our longtime family home, a large colonial property that had become expensive to maintain. After that, they would purchase a modern townhouse closer to the Lake District outside Greenwich, a place she described as more suited to our next stage of life. At the same time, my grandmother Eleanor would be moved into a luxury assisted living residence that specialized in high-end elder care. To celebrate the transition, my mother planned to host a major charity gala dedicated to improving elder support services in Connecticut. It sounded elegant and very expensive. One evening, she asked me to review the financial structure behind the plan. At first, I assumed it would be straightforward, but the deeper I looked into the documents, the more uneasy I became. My father still carried a large unresolved business loan from a failed investment project 2 years earlier. The estimates used to calculate the value of our house were optimistic, assuming repair costs that had not yet been confirmed. Several smaller expenses tied to the planned move had not been accounted for at all. The entire sequence of transactions depended on several things happening in exactly the right order. If even one part of the plan stalled, everything else would start to collapse. I tried to explain this carefully to my mother during a conversation in the kitchen one evening. "Some of these numbers are extremely tight," I told her, turning my laptop so she could see the projections. "If the house sale takes longer than expected, the townhouse purchase becomes risky, and the deposit for the assisted living facility depends on funds that don't technically exist yet." Vivian listened with an expression that grew colder the longer I spoke. "You're overthinking this," she said finally. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm telling you the financial structure is fragile." Her voice sharpened slightly. "You always see problems," she said. "That's what your job does to you." My father didn't say much during the conversation. He simply watched the exchange quietly from the other side of the table. I closed the laptop slowly. "I'm not trying to stop your plan," I said. "I'm trying to make sure it doesn't fall apart later." My mother pushed her chair back. "What falls apart," she replied, "is families where people refuse to support each other." The conversation ended there. I thought that was the end of the disagreement. I didn't realize it was the beginning of something else entirely. The next evening, at 6:18 p.m., my phone lit up with the message that would erase me from the Whitmore family in 3 short sentences. The morning after my mother's message, the house was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. I woke up earlier than usual, made coffee, and sat at the small kitchen table in my apartment with my laptop open. For a few minutes, I simply stared at the screen, rereading the message she had sent the night before. "You're no longer part of this family. Don't contact us again. We're moving forward without you." There was nothing ambiguous about it, no room for interpretation. If someone removes you from a system, you stop performing your role inside that system. That principle applies to financial compliance just as much as it does to families. So I did exactly what my profession had trained me to do. I began documenting my withdrawal. The first email went to the real estate attorney managing the sale of my parents' house. The message was brief and formal. I explained that I was no longer involved in reviewing or verifying any financial documentation related to the Whitmore family's property transactions. I also clarified that any previous documents carrying my digital approval should be independently verified moving forward. The second email went to the broker responsible for the townhouse purchase. The third went to my parents' accountant. Each message contained the same essential statement. I was removing myself from the verification process and would no longer provide compliance oversight for any part of the transaction chain. I didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I didn't include emotional explanations. It was simply procedure. After sending the emails, I opened the financial verification portal my family had been using for several months. The system allowed me to review contracts, confirm the origin of funds, and apply an electronic signature confirming that documents had been examined for irregularities. My access credentials were still active. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I revoked them. I also disabled the digital signature certificate attached to my name, which meant that any document still circulating with my electronic approval would automatically require new verification. Once the final confirmation screen appeared, I closed the system. No drama, no threats, just a clean professional exit. For the next few hours, nothing happened. I went to work, reviewed a series of unrelated hospital compliance files, and attended 2 routine meetings that had nothing to do with my family. By early afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that stepping away from their situation would simply allow them to continue their plans without my involvement. Then the first email arrived. It came from the real estate attorney. The subject line read, "Transaction delay. Verification required." Inside the message was a short explanation. Because my compliance verification had been withdrawn, the buyer's legal team wanted confirmation that the financial representations attached to the Whitmore property sale were still valid. Without that confirmation, they could not proceed. I read the email once and closed it without responding. 20 minutes later, another message appeared. This one came from the contractor scheduled to begin repairs on my parents' house before the sale. The work order had been temporarily suspended because the financing documents linked to the project were no longer marked as verified. By late afternoon, a third message arrived. This one came from the assisted living facility where my grandmother was supposed to move. The email was polite but direct. Could you please confirm whether you are still overseeing the financial documentation connected to Ms. Eleanor Whitmore's residency agreement? I did not answer. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because my mother had been very clear about the boundaries she wanted. Don't contact us again, so I didn't. Instead, I closed my laptop and went for a walk along the river path near my apartment. The air was cool and quiet, the kind of calm evening that usually helps me clear my head after a long day. Yet even while I walked, I knew something else had already begun. My family had built their entire financial transition around the assumption that I would keep their system running smoothly behind the scenes. They had planned the house sale, the townhouse purchase, the assisted living deposit, and the charity gala, as if those pieces would naturally align. But systems like that only function when someone is maintaining them, and for the first time in years, I had stepped away. The consequences of that decision wouldn't appear immediately, but they were already beginning to move. Slowly, quietly, and far beyond my family's control. The first call came just after noon. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a compliance report when my phone vibrated across the table. The screen showed my father's name. For a moment, I simply watched it ring. I didn't answer. The call went to voicemail, and a few seconds later, the notification appeared. His message was short. Elena, there's been a misunderstanding. Call me back when you get this. His tone sounded calm, almost casual, as if the situation could still be smoothed over with a quick conversation. 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same name. This time his voice sounded less composed. You need to call us today. This isn't funny. I listened to the message once and then set the phone face down on the desk. By early evening, there were 12 missed calls. Some were from my father, a few were from my mother, which surprised me more than anything else. The woman who had written "Don't contact us again" less than 24 hours earlier was now apparently willing to call repeatedly. I still didn't answer. The next morning, the number climbed higher. 37 missed calls. The family group chat, which had been silent for weeks before the argument, suddenly became active again. My younger sister, Claire, was the first person to write. How could you do this right before the move? Another message followed minutes later. Mom says everything is falling apart because of what you did. I stared at the screen for a moment. Not because the accusation surprised me, but because it revealed something important. They still believed I was responsible for holding their system together. I didn't respond. Instead, I returned to the compliance reports on my desk and continued working through the afternoon as if the messages didn't exist. Late that day, another email arrived. This one came from Graham Pike, the real estate attorney who had been managing my parents' property transactions. His subject line was noticeably more direct: urgent financial representation issue. When I opened the message, the tone had changed from polite to concerned. We appear to have a serious problem involving several financial representations connected to the Whitmore property transfer. I scheduled a brief call with him that afternoon. The moment he began explaining the situation, the scale of the problem became clear. My parents had already presented their plan to several parties. They had told the townhouse seller that funds from the house sale were fully verified. They had assured the assisted living facility that the deposit for my grandmother's residency was secured. And perhaps most importantly, they had been speaking publicly about their upcoming charity gala as if their financial transition was already complete. But the reality behind those claims looked very different. The townhouse had not yet been purchased, the family house had not yet been sold, and several of the financial assurances used to support those plans had been linked to my compliance verification. Without it, everything stalled. The buyer's legal team wants confirmation, Graham explained carefully, and the assisted living facility is asking whether you're still supervising the financial documentation. I'm not, I said simply. He paused for a moment. I assumed that might be the case, he replied. From the tone of his voice, I could tell he was beginning to understand how the situation had unfolded. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on my desk and checked my notifications again. More missed calls had appeared. 48. By the end of that evening, the number reached 64. My father had called repeatedly. My mother had called even more. Claire had left 3 messages asking why I was doing this to the family. I listened to the voicemails once, then I turned the phone off. For years, my family believed that the quiet work I did behind the scenes was simply a small favor I performed whenever they needed help. What they had never understood was that their entire plan depended on something much larger than a favor. It depended on trust. And once my mother decided I was no longer part of the family, the system she had relied on for years stopped working. Not because I attacked it, but because I simply stepped away. And without the person maintaining it, the structure they had built so confidently was beginning to collapse on its own. 2 days after the calls began, a message arrived from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. It came from a woman named Laura Chen, a donor coordinator who occasionally worked with the same hospital foundations my mother supported. Her message was short and cautious. I thought you should see this. Attached to the email was a draft document. It was the preliminary invitation for my mother's upcoming charity gala. The event was scheduled to take place at the Greenwich Historical Conservatory, a glass-walled venue overlooking the river that was often used for high-profile fundraisers. I had attended events there before. It was the kind of place where wealthy donors discussed compassion over champagne. I opened the document expecting the usual language that appears in fundraising invitations. But one paragraph stopped me cold. The introduction described my mother as a devoted daughter caring for her elderly mother while navigating the challenges of a deeply painful family estrangement. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. My mother had not simply cut me out of the family. She had already begun rewriting the story. In the narrative she was preparing to present to donors, I had become the estranged child who abandoned the family during a difficult transition. The implication was clear. Vivian Whitmore was carrying the burden of responsibility alone while dealing with a daughter who refused to support her. It was a perfect sympathy narrative, and sympathy narratives raise money. As I continued reading the draft invitation, the story became even clearer. The gala would celebrate what my mother called a new chapter for the Whitmore family, one that included relocating my grandmother to a premier assisted living residence and supporting broader elder care initiatives across the region. To anyone reading the invitation, it would sound like a graceful act of devotion, but I knew something the donors did not. The financial structure supporting that story was already unstable. The townhouse purchase had stalled, the sale of the family home was uncertain, and the assisted living facility had already begun asking questions about the financial verification that no longer existed. Yet the gala invitation spoke as if everything had already been finalized. That was the moment I realized the situation had become more dangerous than I originally thought. If the financial system collapsed while my name still appeared on verification documents, the consequences would not stay limited to my family. In the professional world where I worked, compliance failures could destroy reputations overnight. My mother might be comfortable reshaping a family story, but I could not allow my professional credibility to be dragged into it. So I made a decision. I would attend the gala, not to argue, not to create a dramatic confrontation, but to make one thing very clear. My name was no longer part of the system she was presenting to the world. The event took place 3 nights later. The Greenwich Historical Conservatory looked exactly the way I remembered. Glass walls glowing against the dark evening sky, valet attendants guiding luxury cars through the entrance, and clusters of well-dressed guests gathering beneath warm lights, while waiters moved quietly through the room with trays of champagne. Inside, the atmosphere carried the familiar tone of upper-tier charity events. Polite laughter, soft piano music, conversations about generosity that rarely mention the complicated financial mechanics behind it. I arrived quietly and stood near the entrance for a moment, watching the room. At the far side of the conservatory, my mother was speaking with several donors. She looked exactly the way she always did at these events, confident, composed, and perfectly comfortable in the center of attention. Then her eyes moved across the room and landed on me. For a fraction of a second, the expression on her face changed. The color drained from it so quickly that even from across the room I could see the reaction. She excused herself from the group immediately and walked toward me, her pace controlled but noticeably faster than before. "Elena," she said under her breath when she reached me, "what are you doing here?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. She glanced around quickly, making sure none of the nearby guests were listening. "We need to talk outside," she added. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said quietly. By that point, several donors had already begun to notice the tension in her posture, and once attention turns towards something in a room like that, it rarely fades quickly. My mother understood that, which meant the moment she saw me standing there, she also realized something else. The version of the story she had prepared for this evening was about to meet the one person who could prove it wasn't true. The ballroom of the Greenwich Historical Conservatory was full by the time my mother began her speech. Tall glass walls reflected the warm glow of chandeliers, and clusters of donors stood with champagne in their hands while listening politely. Conversations faded as Vivian Whitmore stepped onto the stage with the practiced elegance of someone who had hosted dozens of charity events. "Tonight," she began, "we gather not only to support elder care, but to recognize the dignity every person deserves in their later years." Several guests nodded approvingly. She continued with a carefully constructed story about responsibility, compassion, and the emotional weight of caring for aging parents while navigating personal hardship. "Sometimes," she said softly, "family relationships become complicated." A few sympathetic smiles appeared in the audience. That was the moment I stepped fully into the room. The sound of my shoes against the polished floor wasn't loud, but it was enough. Heads turned slowly, one by one, until my mother's eyes finally found me across the room. Her expression changed instantly. The warm confidence she had been presenting to the donors vanished. For a brief second, she looked genuinely frightened. She stopped speaking. "Elena," she said quietly when she reached me, forcing a tight smile for the nearby guests, "we need to talk outside." I shook my head. "No," I replied calmly. By now the attention of half the room had shifted toward us. My mother lowered her voice. "You're making a scene," she whispered. "I'm asking questions," I said. I turned slightly so the nearby donors could hear. "Just 3. The room grew silent. "First," I said, "has the assisted living facility been told that the deposit depends on a real estate transaction that hasn't actually been completed?" Several people exchanged uneasy glances. "Second," I continued, "have the buyers of the Whitmore house been informed that the actual repair costs are significantly higher than the estimates used in the sale documents?" Now the silence deepened. "And third," I finished, "why does my financial verification still appear on several documents after my mother told me I was no longer part of the family?" No one spoke. Then one of the charity trustees stepped forward carefully. "Ms. Whitmore," he asked my mother, "was Elena still overseeing the financial documentation?" I answered before she could. "Not after she told me to never contact the family again." The words settled across the room like a quiet explosion. Within minutes, the atmosphere of the gala began to unravel. Two board members guided my mother into a side office for a private discussion. A legal advisor representing the charity organization arrived shortly afterward. Several donors quietly placed their champagne glasses on the nearest tables and began leaving the conservatory. The speeches stopped. The music stopped. The entire evening collapsed under the weight of a few unanswered questions. I walked out before anyone asked me to stay. Outside, the night air felt cold and clean. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for holding everything together. 6 weeks later, the consequences became clear. The townhouse my parents had planned to purchase was sold to someone else. The assisted living facility canceled the agreement after reviewing the incomplete financial verification. My mother quietly lost her position on the charity board. My father eventually sold the Whitmore house for significantly less than the price they had expected. My sister stopped appearing at the social events she once loved, and I bought a small condo of my own. No family meetings, no dramatic confrontations, just distance. What I learned from all of it was something my job had taught me long before my family ever did. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't destroying someone's world. It's simply refusing to keep it standing. If you've ever been the person everyone depends on until the moment you stop fixing their problems, you probably understand this story. Standing up to manipulation doesn't always require anger or confrontation. Sometimes it only requires one decision: to step back, to stop carrying what was never truly yours. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing to the channel, because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to keep carrying other people's lies.